Hey everybody, welcome back. So in this video, I wanted to talk about the kind of basics of how to go set up a DevOps career path in 2021. So at the time of this video, it's March in 2021, and this is going to be a fairly general kind of overview of how to go build that type of career path. It's geared more towards people in the relative beginnings of their career, but it could also be people that are sort of transitioning from other parts of tech and IT. So you could be coming to this from a pure development background, but you could also be coming to this from a traditional ops slash systems administration background. Both of those would be completely legitimate, and we're going to take a look at sort of an overview of different things that you would want to go ahead and do to build a career path. And I think that this is a kind of a career path that you could tweak and use to end up in a lot of other ancillary careers, right? So if you wanted to go more of a traditional route, you could go tweak this to focus more on databases and become a senior DBA. You could go ahead and tweak this and become a cloud engineer. You could go tweak this and become a traditional style Unix administrator, where by traditional I mean you do things like deployment, you do things like programming, scripting, troubleshooting, all that kind of stuff. So let's just jump right into it. And also, this is not intended to be a complete or exhaustive or perfect list. This is just a like, hey, this is how to get started with things. So especially for you folks who watch this channel and are well established in your career and have a background in this stuff, feel free to chime in. And if you disagree with something that I put in here, or if you think that I left something out, throw that into the comments, because that helps everybody. So let me go ahead and share out my main screen. And basically the idea is that we're going to have to start off with some fundamentals, and you may already have these, and if you do, great. You don't need this, but for people who are really just kind of starting out, you'd want to go ahead and kind of get the fundamentals out of the way first. So let's see, fundamentals. That's weird. Let's go change this to something better. All right, that works. So fundamentals. So when we're talking about fundamentals, we want to be looking at operating systems, right? And mainly this is going to be Linux these days, but probably Microsoft as well, depending on what kind of environment you're going to work in. You should at least know how to set up a basic Windows server and things like that. You don't necessarily need to be an expert. And you can probably leave that off. I'd probably make that one of the lower priority things these days, but really handy. There's still tons of Windows shops out there, and people who are doing DevOps stuff in Windows-oriented environments. That's I've done that, right? So when I worked at Microsoft, we were arguably one of the first places that was implementing a lot of this stuff. I know that my old boss went over to Amazon and kind of spread a lot of the kind of things that we were doing, over there. And you can certainly go do this with a Microsoft technology stack. We were still, focused in a lot of our tooling at the time that I was there, and this sort of transitioned off by the time I left to Microsoft stuff. But we were still using a lot of open open source at the time that I left. But that's neither here nor there. A lot of the concept stuff, right? You want to be familiar with operating systems. So, first things first, get a Linux system set up, right? So that could be your laptop, that could be a virtual machine, that could be a Raspberry Pi, whatever it is. All right, so that's the first thing. The second thing we want to look at is networking. Right, so we want to have our networking kind of in place. Now, this does not need to be super, super, super deep at this point, right? So if you're kind of just starting off, we're going to be looking at things like IP4, IP6 to a lesser extent. You want to know what it is and how a IP6 IP address looks like, and some of the stuff about how they do address discovery. But you really, that's much lower priority than IP4. You want to understand things like routing, right, and NAT, and firewalls. You don't necessarily need to know how to implement a firewall at this point, but you want to understand the sort of various kind of concepts of how these things work, generally speaking. So the next thing that I would look at is something like revision control systems. Right. No, I threw V in there. RCS. And basically these days that means Git, right? So you'd want to know Git. So that's operating systems, networking, and then Git, right? And then we want to introduce programming and scripting, right? So this arguably is built into the OS piece to some extent. That's one of the reasons why you see a lot of the kind of DevOps methodologies and approaches and automation kind of stuff coming more out of the Unix environments than it was coming from the Windows environments. Not saying that people on the Windows side don't do this, but until PowerShell really became big, right? CMD batch scripting wasn't quite as capable. So we want to look at something like Bash, right, or PowerShell. Right. So that's one place to kind of start off. We can also, I'm just going to go call it coding, right? Because that's going to be kind of a sort of a catch-all, right? So I'm not going to draw a distinction between scripting and programming. I'm going to say Python here, right? And Bash and PowerShell, right? Doesn't really matter either one. Again, there's alternatives to all of these things, right? This is not intended to be your sort of master, final, ultimate version of this stuff, right? So we want to know operating systems. We want to know networking. We want to know some kind of revision control system, and we want to know coding, right? So that's kind of our kind of fundamentals here. And then what we're going to go do is I'm going to call this sort of our secondary, right, or intermediate is probably a better way to kind of call this. So let me go do this, right? All right, so we got our intermediate stuff over here. And that's going to get into kind of more extended, ways to go handle a lot of different things. So we're going to be looking at, getting into things like networking, well, let's say, right? So we're going to be looking into, software-defined routing potentially, and software-defined networking. Things like Open vSwitch, VNATs, or VNets, bridge networks, things along those lines. We definitely want to know things like proxies. We want to know load balancing. Load balancing, by the way, I feel is a really overlooked thing. Right? People don't delve into load balancing nearly as much as they probably should, or at least people wait way longer and then it's not a difficult thing, but it adds a huge amount of value. Not necessarily going to get you tons of look on your resume, although it might, right? So we want to be able to go look at those things. We want to go look at services, right? So what I'm talking about is major web services, things like DNS, right? We want to look at things like HTTPS, SMTP, etc. Right? So, that's not a complete list, but you want to understand major web services, and all that kind of stuff that entails in terms of like a conceptual understanding of how those things generally work. So that's a really, really useful thing. We want to look at configuration management. Right. So this is going to be, partially, from Git, right? We can manage configurations in Git. That's one way to go do this. But we also want to look at things like Ansible, right? Terraform, right, etc. Right, and again, feel free to substitute whatever you want here. This could be Puppet, this could be SaltStack, right? Whatever you want to go do. So that's our sort of intermediate kind of level. Well, we also want to have virtualization, which is a big piece here. So we want to have virtualization, right? And virtualization, I'm going to use as a catch-all for both traditional VMs, things like VMware, KVM, OpenStack, that kind of thing, as well as containerization, right? They're different, but the idea is that we want to know, I would say, a traditional virtualization platform. So I would probably pick, KVM here, but you could equally pick, VMware, right, or potentially Hyper-V. But I think that KVM is probably going to be your best bet in this case. We also want to know containers. Right, so containers are going to lead us to, Docker, probably. This could be Podman, this could be LXC, this could be FreeBSD jails, but I think Docker is probably what you want to go do, because that's going to get you, a keyword on your resume. So, right, and we also want to be able to go kind of tie that into, things like, Ansible and virtualization as a way to go manage things like this, right? So Terraform is really useful in this sense. We want to be able to look at, and actually I can probably shrink this down a little bit. All right, so the other thing we want to be able to look at is stuff that kind of ties into to virtualization, and also just sort of general systems kind of stuff. So we want to be able to look at storage, for example, right? And also sort of thinking about this in terms of like network compute storage, right? So abstraction is a really big piece that we're kind of looking into, right? We want to be able to go abstract stuff away. So storage is going to be things like NFS, cloud storage, potentially things like SAN, right? But I think that's a pretty good kind of place to start. We also want to look at monitoring, right? Right, so we want to look at, Grafana, right? Maybe we want to look at maybe Nagios, Prometheus. There's a bunch of different tools you can go ahead and use to manage things. We want to look at cloud providers, right? right? Where we're going to be looking at, probably AWS. But honestly, it doesn't really matter what cloud provider you use. You could do AWS, you could do Azure, you could do Google Cloud, but a cloud provider, right? So we want to be able to go look at those and be fairly comfortable in that kind of environment where we can go ahead and deploy systems very easily, and have all the kind of benefits of this. And we also want to look at things like CID or CI/CD pipelines, right? So CI/CD is going to be a general sort of overall encompassing idea here, right? But we'll say the CI/CD management tools, right? So thinking something like GitHub CI, GitLab has a version. Jenkins, I think, is probably your best bet here because that's the most commonly used. But you want to know a tool, and a lot of this is going to be sort of driven by what's useful in your area, right? So if you see that you're in Chicago, and for whatever reason everyone there seems to be using Travis instead of Jenkins, invest more time into Travis. I think most of these things, and this is one of the things that you'll see as you kind of progress in your career, you probably already have come across at this point yourself, is that understanding the conceptual frameworks of things and the ability to learn stacks, right? So, if you know Jenkins, you're going to be translating it into another tool, right? So if you are familiar with one thing, and then you get a job where they use a different tool, you're going to be fine. Just like if you're somebody who gets to a reasonable level of competence writing code in Python, and then you go to work in an environment and they say, hey, we want you to do Golang, you're going to be able to pick that up, right? It's going to be a little bit of time, but it's not going to be that big of a deal. So CI/CD. What else we want to have? We want to be able to know what databases, right? Right. So databases are critical when it comes to I'm going to say modern environments, but it's not even modern. Databases have been critical for 30 years, something like that. So you want to know, I would say, you want to know a relational database system, right? So I'd probably say Postgres. You could do MySQL, but I'd probably say Postgres at the point, or MariaDB/MySQL is same thing basically. But a relational database, and then you probably want to know a NoSQL database, right? So those would be big. And then the final thing I would look at is orchestration. So when it comes to orchestration, you're basically looking at Kubernetes is the big one, but you can plug in things to orchestrate. All orchestration basically means is the ability to deploy the required resources in a agile, elastic manner, right? So you want to have the right number of instances running on your cloud provider to be able to handle the load, and you don't want to have any more, right? And you want to have this to be elastic, so it's scaling. And using a tool like Kubernetes or something like Ansible or something like Terraform allows you to go ahead and manage that infrastructure dynamically and to do things like deployments effectively. Now, that's really one area where something like Kubernetes really is quite big, but you can do Canary or blue-green deployments with Ansible, right? Just like you could with Kubernetes. You're going to be a slightly different approach, but You know, I think it's probably good to learn Kubernetes because it's incredibly high value, but also because it's going to establish a lot of the kind of framework which you could then apply to you know managing your systems with another tool. And then when it comes to sort of the more advanced kind of category, let me go get some more room over here. Go back to my pen. A lot of it is really just kind of specializing in these kind of areas. So, you could really be, putting a large amount of emphasis into any one of these areas, right? So, if you go ahead and, focus on, oops, what's going on there? That's weird. All right. Right. You can focus on, being a virtualization specialist, right? You could be a storage specialist. You could be, a Kubernetes, expert. Excuse me. And you can focus on, any one of these particular areas and then get really deep. There are people who specialize in just logging and, really kind of get into deep that. And I should probably put that underneath monitoring. Right. So, people who go very, very deep into those things. But what I think, same thing with cloud, right? There's a ton of different variations on these. If you're specializing in managing and monitoring services and deployment, well, you're probably going to be an SRE, right? So there's a number of these. So really specializing in the kind of advanced category is just the idea that it is impossible to be incredibly deep in every single one of these areas, right? So what you want to do is you want to have a good understanding of most of this stuff, and then you want to have a deep understanding in one of those things, or two of those things, if you want to be, a specialist. And there's this sort of idea of wide and deep learning, where what you want to do is you don't want to go super specialist in the beginning. What you want to do is, like, let's say that these are all the things right? So you start off with like Linux, and you learn some Linux stuff, right? Well, as you learn Linux, you're also going to learn some networking stuff, right? So that's going to put networking over here. And, you might want to go add a little bit of knowledge over here. And when you add a little bit of knowledge to the networking stuff, that's going to go add some more to your Linux expertise, because then you're going to understand, like, what is a bridge network? What is, VLANs? Well, I can go implement VLANs on Linux. And, what is Ether channel? Well, I can implement Ether channel on my servers, and that can be useful, right? But if you try to go learn tons and tons and tons and tons of little things, there's no way that you're going to be an expert in all of them. Excuse me. So what you want to do is you want to kind of get a broad understanding of a lot of different things. And you kind of want to focus on a few things. And then that's going to probably be your best bet, because we learn, cloud over here. Well, cloud is going to have networking components. It's going to be, managing with Linux. So bump these guys up, bump these guys up. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have all your fundamentals down, right? So you want to really make sure that you understand, your basic networking stuff. You want to understand operating systems. You want to understand how to go ahead and write code regardless of what language that is. And generally that's going to be, kind of your building blocks, going back to our, intermediate stuff, or to our fundamental stuff, right? We want to make sure that we have an understanding of operating systems, networking, revision control, and then Git. So for all this stuff, I would say you probably want to have a let's say 90% comfort level with these things, right? Well, I don't know. That's pretty high. So let's say you want to have let's say an 80%, right? This is kind of going to the idea of, the 80-20 rule, right? So you're going to get a lot of benefit from learning this kind of 20%, right, foundational kind of stuff really well. And then we can go ahead and take that. And this is not saying that you're going to be, super, super, super deep, because, that last 20% of operating systems is a career path, right? That's a specialty in computer science, and you become a, kernel engineer, and you're reading, the design and implementation of the FreeBSD operating system, and, all those kind of classic books. That's great. I think that's a really cool thing. But in terms of building an initial career path, I would learn like Linux, right? Just be comfortable with managing a Linux server, starting and stopping services, troubleshooting it, installing packages, foundational stuff. Coding, you want to be able to go ahead and write basic scripts that do useful things, right? And then, you want to be able to push that code to Git, right? You want to be able to go ahead and pull. You want to be able to go ahead and, add files, do commits. You want to be able to do pretty basic stuff. You don't necessarily need to get into like merging branches at this point. That's probably not something that you would need, but you'll also kind of pick that stuff up later as you maybe focus more time on coding. And as you get into things like Ansible and managing infrastructure as code and stuff like that. So I'd probably say you want to spend a lot of time on your fundamentals and make sure that you're really good and dialed in there. And then when it gets to your infrastructure stuff, or your intermediate stuff, I want to say, you want to spend some time on all of these things, right? So you want to be comfortable with, services, right? I might even move services back over here to fundamentals, because you just sort of need to understand those. You could probably put them underneath networking, maybe, or systems. And then what you want to do is you want to pick a few of these and allocate a decent chunk of time. So let's say we want to go with Ansible, containers, and cloud, right? So what we'll do is we'll give those guys, we want to learn like the 80% of those things, right? And then for the rest of the stuff, we want to learn like 20-25% stuff, right? The basic functional pieces of those things, right? So, right, how to go ahead and, spin up a container that has Nginx in it, but you don't necessarily really need to understand the details of how to go really configure Nginx. You can just go spin it up, maybe use Ansible to configure it to do a load balancing proxy, or you use one that already exists that's already set up that way, and you just tweak it, right? Things like that, right? You don't necessarily need to get super, super deep into it. Instead of really diving into IP tables, you use something like pfSense as a framework, or you use a built-in cloud firewall, right? Things along those lines. So you want to go, kind of a middle route. And then basically, whichever one of these you are, spending more time on, right? You're learning the 80% of those things, right? You then have the option to either, right, as your career advances, learn additional tools more, right? So you say, all right, I want to really kind of get more into monitoring. So you then shift that over from the 20% to the 80% category. And then you're becoming a really solid generalist, right? And there's no need to go to the advanced level, by the way, right? Advanced level is not better than intermediate. The advanced is specializing, right? So if you do find something that you particularly tend towards, right, that you have maybe a passion for, you really kind of enjoy that element of working with, that's where you go and say, I really like working with databases. I think the idea of trying to go figure out the structure of a database is really interesting to me. Maybe I like SQL. Maybe you are kind of really interested in NoSQL databases and how to go stack something like Redis on top of a key value pair database or whatever it is. Right? Maybe you go more towards that direction, or you really like coding, whatever it is. Then you kind of really spend your additional time learning, focusing on that particular thing. And you can make a lot of money that way. The only downside is, our industry changes very rapidly. So it's entirely possible that you'll spend a lot of effort, becoming an expert in something, and then it's obsoleted, right? Whereas if you were a really, really, really solid generalist, which is kind of the category that I would put myself into, you might argue that I specialize in operating systems, but I think I'm kind of a senior generalist. I can do pretty much all of these things well and pretty competently, but I'm not necessarily going to be digging into Linux kernel, or I'm not necessarily going to be the guy you'd want to come on board to really design your network architecture. You can do your basic network architecture, right? I get your basic setup kind of stuff, but it's going to take me longer than somebody who really specializes in that to get things all set up and configured, whatever it is. So that's the idea. I would love to hear the thoughts of other people who work in tech who can have a different take on things. You think there's anything that I left out? You think that there's anything that's more useful than the stuff that we've kind of listed here? For the folks who are getting started with this, I think it's having some kind of roadmap can be really, really useful, because I think a lot of times it's really a question of like, how do I get started with this? And at some level, the correct way to start is just to start, even if you don't allocate your resources in the right place. As you learn more about it, you'll correct for that. But yeah, I think that's generally the idea. I'm not talking about any particular certifications or classes or things here. I'm just kind of leaving it generally as sort of categories. But the idea is that as you learn about these things, you will notice people referring to particular tests, right? And then particular certifications and things like that. So those are the big ones. Also, the one thing I left out here is home lab, home lab, home lab, home lab, home lab. Start off and set up a home lab so that, whether it's just a couple Raspberry Pis or whatever it is, if you're going to be doing virtualization, do virtualization at home. If you're going to be somebody who's going to be, deploying software, we'll set up a website and, set up a CI/CD pipeline so that, you deploy your new version of WordPress to your home lab first, and then it gets pushed out to your Amazon instance, whatever it is. But build a home lab so that you can go ahead and have this stuff. If you're going to be doing scripting and automation and stuff, get on GitHub. Look for an open source project that needs help. You want something to put on your resume that's pretty quick and pretty easy, that most people could probably do. The FreeBSD project is great. They have a ports tree. They're always looking for people to help manage ports. So basically what that means is you go compile, right? Compile a piece of software, see if it breaks, and then if it does, try to fix it. And it's usually probably just like a library is missing, or things like that. And they could always use help with that. So, if you're looking for something, that's a good one. But there's tons of open source projects out there. Contribute to some, right? Write a little shell script to make something easier. Put it on your GitHub page. Put it on your resume. Stuff like that. So, anyway, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one.